Hi, my name is Martin Holdridge. I'm a postdoc with USGS and Northern Arizona University. And today I'm going to be talking about work that was done by a subgroup that was part of the larger sagebrush conservation design effort that focused on climate change impacts on sagebrush ecological integrity. So this was a collaborative effort between many folks from multiple agencies and universities. As you've seen in the previous talks, sagebrush ecological integrity has now been pretty well mapped. And just as a reminder, the core areas are in dark blue, growth opportunities in light blue, and other rangeland areas in tan. So the question then is, what is the trajectory of these ecosystems? And so that's something we really want to understand. In other words, under climate change, what might this map look like in the future? And that's important for a number of reasons. The first is it'll help prioritize where to defend and grow the core. So areas that are likely to be durable because they're going to stay more climatically suitable to maintain core sagebrush habitats in the future. Similarly, understanding these trajectories is going to be important for informing kind of other climate adaptation decisions. For example, areas that are degraded and maybe they will become less climatically suitable for high ecological integrity in the future. Those are places we might want to consider other management options such as accepting or directing ecological change. And so I want to highlight the research questions that we're focusing on this talk. So the first was, how will the abundance of sagebrush ecological integrity classes change in the future? So how will that map that we just looked at change in the future? We also wanted to consider uncertainty. So there's a lot of uncertainty when considering ecological responses to climate change. And so one thing we want to do is just look at how our results vary across a lot of different climate futures to try to at least get somewhat of a handle on that uncertainty. And lastly, we want to understand what's driving these changes that we're projecting. So that can then inform whether management decisions will need to vary spatially depending on different drivers of ecological change in different places. I'm going to be pretty brief on our methods today, but there are a few things that I wanted to highlight. So the first is we use kind of a modeling approach to understand how plant functional types might change when going from a current climate scenario to a future climate scenario. So how might the growth of these plants change? And so the model we used is called StepWatt, and it has two components. So it has a water balance component and a plant community component. So the way the water balance component works is it takes daily weather information, soil properties, and plant properties. And then using that information, it's simulating the amount of water that's available for plants. So that water is then treated as the resource because these are water limited ecosystems. So kind of to simplify a little bit, the amount of water that's available at the right soil depths and the right times of year defines the amount of growth you can have of an individual plant functional type. So the more water available, you can then get more growth of potential, like things like sagebrush, and we also simulate annual grasses and forbs, perennial grasses and forbs. And so what the model is doing is it's simulating the establishment and growth of individual plants. We're then also trying to incorporate some disturbance, including feedbacks between vegetation and wildfire. So we recently developed a simple equation that's relating long-term average fire probability in sagebrush ecosystems to average climate and average climate and fuels conditions. And that'll be coming out in fire ecology shortly. And the other thing that we're incorporating in this model is the effects of elevated CO2 on plants, so we can kind of get an understanding of how that might affect plant water use efficiency in the future. The next step is then to try to incorporate these simulation results into our calculations of sagebrush ecological integrity. So to back up for a second, under current conditions, sagebrush ecological integrity is calculated based on remotely sensed products. So the amount of sagebrush, perennials, annuals, conifers, and human modification is defining that sagebrush ecological integrity, where sagebrush and perennials have a positive effect on SEI and the other factors have a negative effect. So then the question is, well, how do we try to estimate that under a future climate condition? And the way we did that is by adjusting the remotely sensed estimates of cover based on our simulation results. And so we did that for sagebrush perennials and annuals. So for example, we might simulate under current conditions a certain amount of sagebrush, and then we simulate, say, 20% less for that location in the future. So then we would take the remotely sensed estimate of sagebrush for that place, reduce it by 20%, and call that our estimate of sagebrush in the future for a given climate scenario. And like I mentioned, so we did that also for perennials and annuals. We had to assume that conifers and human modification were going to stay at present levels, and we made that assumption just because we didn't have information on how those factors might change in the future. We just didn't have access to projections. I now want to get into the results for our first question, which was changing how our changes in sagebrush ecological integrity classes will change in the future. So Kevin queued that up a little bit. I just want to go back on how this color matrix works, because that's how a few of our figures look. So on the left-hand side, that's the current classification. And then across the top, that's the future projected classification. So the diagonal shows places where we're not projecting a change. So for example, the dark blue is an area that's core sagebrush now, and we're projecting it to be core sagebrush in the future. The light red is core sagebrush now, we're projecting it to be a growth opportunity area in the future, and so on. So this is that map showing those colors, and this is for an intermediate climate scenario at the end of the century. And if we look at the dark blue, those are core sagebrush areas that we're calling stable. So what we mean by stable is not necessarily that it will be a core sagebrush area in the future, but it will remain climatically suitable to potentially be core in the future, so that there isn't a major decline in climate suitability. And that actually, we're defining a roughly like 2/3 of current core is climatically stable in this way. So these are areas where prioritizing defending and growing is likely to be most stable in the long run. So we have most durable, potentially most durable conservation in those places. And that's a little bit in contrast to some places here in the lighter red that are core now, and we're projecting them to become other growth opportunity areas in the future. So that's a decline in climate suitability. So there, potentially defending that core in the long run might be a little bit more difficult. Lastly, there are other types of areas I want to highlight where they're a growth opportunity area now, and we're projecting them to become an other rangeland area in the future. So those kind of places are often drier, and they're already harder to restore, and we're projecting them to get worse from a climate perspective. So potentially accepting or directing that ecological change is a more viable option. In this next slide, I want to highlight a little bit of the climate uncertainty in these results. So the colors of these bars correspond to the colors of the different transitions that we were just talking about, where individual bars within a color group are different climate scenarios and time periods. And so the bars I'm highlighting here, that's the areas corresponding to the map I just showed for the intermediate climate scenario end of century. And there's just a couple things I want to highlight here. First is the far right red bar there, that's end of century for more extreme climate scenarios. So that in that case, perhaps not surprisingly, we're projecting more losses of core. So that's the area we're projecting to be loss of core. Similarly, if we look at the orange, those are places that are growth opportunity areas where we're projecting them to be become other rangeland areas. And if we look at the more extreme climate scenario on the right there, we're projecting nearly 3 times as much loss than under an intermediate scenario. So there is quite a bit of variability across these different scenarios. One thing I want to point out also is the error bar. So that's quite large in this end of century, more extreme scenario. And that's reflecting uncertainty kind of in the climate system response to a given emission scenario. So that's the range and responses we're getting in our results across 13 different global climate models. But one kind of key takeaway is there's a lot of variability here, but the key message is similar. We've got a fair bit of stable core, and then also a fair bit of projected loss. And that the amount of those areas varies between these scenarios. I want to show this uncertainty in a little bit of a different way. So here in dark blue are areas that we're calling robust stable cores. So those are places where our results from more than 90% of the global climate models we use are agreeing it'll remain stable. So we've got kind of a strong signal or a robust signal that is going to stay stable under this intermediate emission scenario. And that actually is most of the robust core, or most of the stable core is robust in our results. So we've got a fairly strong evidence for many of these places. If we look at growth opportunity areas, the stable ones, that's in dark purple, these are again robust, so most of our results are agreeing that they will remain growth opportunity areas. I now want to change gears a little bit and talk about what's driving these projected changes we're talking about. And so to explain how this map works, we have areas in red where that's where sagebrush is the primary driver of our projected changes in sagebrush ecological integrity. Blue are areas where annuals are driving the projected changes. And similarly, perennials are, when perennials are driving that change, that's shown in green. And then colors in between just mean it's kind of an average of those multiple drivers. One thing that I kind of want to just take away from this is if you squint, you can just see a lot of different colors. That means that the main drivers are varying a lot spatially. Potentially the management actions needed will also vary spatially quite a lot. One thing that I'd want to highlight though is if we look at just places where we are core now and we're projecting loss of core, that loss is generally either driven by a decrease in the amount of sagebrush we're simulating or an increase in the amount of annuals, or combination of the two. So both of those are similarly important for those declines. I want to dig a little bit deeper into some of these trends for these individual plant functional types. So this map is showing projected changes in the quality scores of sagebrush. So these quality scores are related to the amount of sagebrush, and those are the values that are actually going into the calculation of sagebrush ecological integrity. And so red areas are places where we're projecting a decline in the amount of sagebrush in the future. And you can see that's especially true in the northern Great Basin. That's where we're projecting some of those greatest declines. That's also some of the places there where we're having larger interactions between wildfire and climate. If we look at perennials separately, you can see that these are again the quality scores. And so places in red are where we're projecting declines in perennials, places in blue projecting increases in perennials. Overall, we're getting more muted changes that we're simulating in the amount of perennials. So that's why perennials are not having as big of effect on the places where we're projecting changes in core. And lastly, looking at annuals, here we're projecting declines in the quality score for annuals. That's again the red area, and a decline in the quality score of annuals means more annuals. So places where there's more annuals in the future are in red, and that's especially obvious kind of in the northeastern portion of the biome there. And we're generally projecting changes in annuals for a couple reasons. It's increasing wintertime temperatures and changes in precipitation seasonality. That's largely what's defining these changes. And so kind of if you think back to the colored map, it's these three different changes that are then overall defining the losses in core and changes in sagebrush ecological integrity more generally across the region. So I want to back up for a second and just talk about kind of the main key points from this work. So first of all, there's a lot of ongoing changes in these ecosystems. We're getting a lot of losses of core sagebrush areas, as a lot of the other talks in this session will highlight. And a lot of that's due to losses from invasion by annual grasses, the invasive grass fire cycle. And one way to think about climate change is that it's amplifying these ongoing threats. And due to that amplification, we can then expect, at least in some places, losses of core sagebrush area due to climate change. However, there's also a more positive note, which is that a lot of the areas that are core now, we're projecting them to be climatically suitable to still be core in the future. That doesn't mean some other threats still won't be a problem, but from the climate perspective, they can still be core in the future. And what that means for management, I think, is that in these stable core areas, prioritizing defending and growing those stable core areas is very critical and will be most durable in the long run. And then alternatively, there are other areas that are maybe degraded now they're in hot and dry places where restoration is especially difficult, and we're projecting will get more difficult. And so in those places, we may need to consider accepting or directing that ecological change, as far as just focusing on our efforts on the key places.